My name is David Birdsell. I'm the Dean of the Austin Marks School of Public and International Affairs. Thank you. Welcome to the Marks School, welcome to Baruch College, and welcome to the first of this academic year's Lillian Nathan Ackerman Lectures on Equality and Justice. This series has been a terrific opportunity supported by Rosalind and Erwin Engelman, who are here with us this evening, and we'll hear from Rosalind in just a moment, to examine critical issues of social justice in our societies, taken from a wide variety of perspectives. This program funds a chair of Race and Social Justice, the Ackerman Chair, who stewards the lecture series, and then lectures in each semester that bring a variety of people from academia, from professional practice, and a wide range of issue areas to the campus to talk about the things that most animate their quest for justice in the ways that they understand it. So it is with great pleasure that I ask to the podium this evening Rosalind Engelman, who will talk a little bit about the inspiration for this program and where it stands today. Rosalind.
The first thing I want you to see is this. These are all clippings from the New York Times in the last 2 weeks. Administration is ending protection for Haitians. This is from my favorite magazine, The Atlantic. The Making of an American Nazi. This one is Jesse Jackson, a hero of the civil rights movement, and his illness. The probation system stalks blacks. Look in the mirror. We're with stupid. Convicted man free after 45 years, not guilty. Traffickers enslave thousands of Britain's most vulnerable. Venezuela is starving. 50,000 Haitians must leave the United States as White House ends protection. And this is just 2 weeks' worth. I'll just begin by saying thank you, Professor Smith. Our family is so proud to have someone with your credentials and ability as Ackerman Professor. When Erwin wanted to set up a lecture in equality and justice, I immediately understood why. My mother, as a child slave laborer in Russia in World War I, knew neither equality or justice. She always said, and I quote, "You will never love this country as I do because you were born here." She voted until she was 90 years old. My father, Nathan, had a different childhood, but after coming here as a tourist, he found himself marooned and had a difficult time as an immigrant. He didn't have Erwin's acumen at Baruch College. My grandfather, invested most of his money in a currency that would never fold. Pre-Russian Revolution, the Tsar would never go, and he bought Russian rubles. So, in the morning, Erwin, who loves Baruch and his New York Times more than perhaps he loves me, is often greatly inconvenienced because the fact that the paper has holes in it. And I cut or tear out articles that are emotionally resonant with me and sometimes I use them in my art. So thank you, Erwin, for making everything possible. Thank you. Would you believe that citizens of the United States have no water and use PVC pipe to get it when available? It has to be boiled, of course. Electricity went out for them 3 times last week. After the disastrous storm, they were wished good luck and given paper towels. How does such actions save and help people? These are our own citizens, the people of Puerto Rico. Last week, a man was freed after 45 years in jail. The ruling was based on evidence which had been withheld during his trial. How do we give this man his life 45 years later? Immigrants coming into our country must pass a test. It's a test on American values, history, and geography. Wilbur Jones was the man who was freed in jail. By the way, I omitted the fact that he was African American. The system of tests has a 97% passage rate among people wishing to become United States citizens. When given to people here, more than 1 in 3 failed. Recent articles on the probation system document unfair treatment for people of color and Latinos who are often victims of overzealous prosecutions and probation officers like Mr. Jones. Tonight, I really look forward to being enlightened on how their voting rights are endangered. This is the 100th anniversary of JFK's birth. He said to Harry Belafonte, who became a leader of the civil rights movement, quote, "Race has no place in the life of American citizens." Unfortunately, although he hoped to work with Congress to change that situation, as we all know, he didn't live long enough to do that. Voting is a given right, and I mentioned it's a right that my family treasured. I am so proud that we have Juan Cartagena fighting the good fight and here to enlighten us about that process. Thank you.
Well, Rosalind told you the news that I now have to convey, and that is that this year's Ackerman Chair is Professor Robert Courtney Smith on our faculty here in the Mark School of Public and International Affairs. Many of you are familiar with Rob's work. He is a distinguished scholar of migration. He has paid particularly close attention to migration from and to Mexico and New York City. His book, Mexican New York, has won just about every award that it's possible to win from the American Sociological Association and other organizations in the area of migration studies. And Bob's work, I think it bears mention, does walk, not in that book particularly, but in other arenas, across voting rights. His work ranges very much across the issues that actually shape people's lives. And in addition to his scholarship, Rob has been assiduous about trying to make sure that the fruits of that labor actually benefit the communities, people in the communities that he studies. I can't imagine a person better able to take this mantle for this year, and it is my great pleasure to bring to the podium to share a few thoughts with you and to introduce Mr. Cartagena, Rob Smith.
My first thanks will be to Juan for accepting the invitation, and to the Engelmans for setting the Ackerman series up. And I didn't realize, I knew that you were a perfect fit, Juan, for this, because the lecture series is about equality and social justice. It was like family night, though, because the Engelman's daughter has been co-counsel on discrimination cases with Juan Cartagena. So I was sort of like, I'll go sit down, you guys catch up, and it's a lovely thing. But I think that it's a wonderful thing that this lecture series was set up to discuss issues of equality and social justice, which are crucially important, because without those things, access to education is not equal. And we're a university, and if people don't have access to us and to the other kinds of social inclusion in the country, the rights in the Constitution don't matter. So I'm especially pleased then to have Juan Cartagena here tonight. He's a pioneer in issues of voting rights, in issues of fighting discrimination of various kinds. When I started doing Voting Rights Act work about 10 years ago, first working as an expert for the Department of Justice, one of the first questions they asked me was, did you read Juan Cartagena? And there was only one good answer to that question, right? Well, there were two. One is yes, and the other was, I'm reading him now. And some of his stuff has been extremely, extremely influential. He's written on voting rights in New York City, on multi-member districts in New Jersey, on the ways in which Section 5, the now, may it rest in peace, most important pre-clearance section of the Voting Rights Act, affected Latinos. And his work has been, he's also the general counsel and president of the Latino Justice Fund. I didn't know a lot of the things that you actually did. I looked at some of them. I got tired just reading them. I don't know how you did all of these things. Working for years as the general counsel at the Community Service Society, being the legal counsel for Puerto Rico's Department of Community Affairs. He was the head of the counsel for the Bar Association of New Jersey, Hispanic Bar Association. He's been given more awards I can recount here: the Freedom Fighter Award, the MLK Award, the Felix Fishman Award. I'm sure I'm missing most of them, and I apologize. But you guys get the picture. Juan is a very is a serious guy, and he's helped to create these issues and to bring up attention to them in a variety of ways. So I'll say, perhaps one of the most important things was his testimony before Congress in 2006 to reauthorize, in favor of reauthorizing the Voting Rights Act, which was done again. So before we hear from Juan, I'll say just one or two small remarks. Usually when we think about voting rights in the country, it's taught the same way that we usually teach about racial conflict in the country. And it's a really positive story. And it kind of starts like this, right? Well, we started off badly, right? Like, okay, slavery was actually provided for in the Constitution. And yes, we had Jim Crow and black people couldn't vote for 100 years, but we made it better. Right, in the 60s, we had the Voting Rights Act, and there's a sort of self-congratulatory narrative, right? Martin Luther King, we had the 60s, was very tumultuous. Things are good now. And there's a march of history feeling to that narrative, but history can march backwards too. And the Voting Rights Act and the rights of voters, particularly blacks and Latinos, have been under assault in this country. And when you have history marching backwards, you need people to push back. We're encountering right now two very, very dangerous myths about voting. One of them is the myth of voter fraud, in which there is a rampant fear, not much evidence, but a rampant fear of voter fraud. And it's been an interesting, you may talk about this, it's been an interesting evolution. First, there was no documentation, but there was a fear of it. Now the legislators who are pushing for ID laws to guard against voter fraud say, well, there's no evidence of it, but people are afraid of it. but they're afraid of it because you've been saying that it's so, right? It's a circular tautological argument. The other one is the myth of illegal voters, and I should say Latino voters mostly, right? The invisible voters, that the 2 or 3 million of them, I don't know where they were or why they would be trying to vote. But anyway, these are very, very dangerous myths, and they've led to I think, very dangerous public policies. We've lost a very important piece of the Voting Rights Act, to which there are remedies, but it's gone from the potential offenders having to fight Goliath to the potential offendees having to fight David. Anyway, with that brief introduction, please join me in welcoming a pioneer in this work and our first Ackerman Lecture Series speaker, Juan Cartagena. Thank you.
Good evening. I'm so happy to be here to talk about a topic that always excites me and has been an anchor of my work since I came out of school quite a number of years ago. But I also love to thank the Engelmans for making this possible, for sponsoring this lecture series, and for providing the mechanism for me to meet their wonderful daughter, Marianne. Thank you so much. So I want to start with some hope, because we live in trying times. We really do. And I think I want to bookend this by starting with some hope and hopefully ending with some hope. But the fact is that in November of 2016, a year ago, we woke up to this reality that the federal government had changed in a way that many of us didn't expect. Or if we did expect it, we didn't know what it really meant in the first 100 days, 3 months, 9 months. Me and my staff have been running around like chickens without a head. We have been constantly working on things that have come out of this administration to try to slow them down, ameliorate them, or stop them outright. But many of us may not have known that there was a symbol of hope in that election result, but it was a local victory, not a national victory. But it has national implications. Sheriff Joe Arpaio was voted out in November 2016 in Maricopa County, Arizona. A man who literally based his entire career on making life impossible for undocumented people, especially Mexicanos coming across the border. A man who made ostracizing prisoners a hallmark of his career. A man who forced prisoners to wear pink-looking underwear and be housed in tents in the Arizona heat. A man who promoted shackling Latina female prisoners and all women prisoners if they were given birth or in labor while they were imprisoned, shackling them to their beds. A man who enjoyed incredible popularity. A man who President Trump pardoned in his first presidential pardon of his administration. So he was voted out. And it took years and years and years of organizing work. Years and years and years of making sure that what was clearly in the frontmost in the minds of the people who wanted change in Maricopa County, the people who were most directly affected, those Mexicanos and Mexicanas, that they really wanted to have that change, they had to convince who? Very good voices in the white and black communities to join them in voting out Maricopa County Sheriff Joe Arpaio. And when they were able to convince those crossover votes and vote alike in a similar election, and they finally got rid of him, that was a ray of hope. I work now quite extensively on criminal justice matters. And some of our partners are down there in 2 organizations. One is called Puente, Arizona, and the other one is called Mi Gente. And both of them are activist organizations. And both of the leaders of those respective organizations, so 2 Latina women, amazing women, both were telling the whole world, we've been living under Trump-kind policies for the last 10, 15 years with Maricopa County Sheriff Joe Arpaio. So if you want to know how it is to survive Trump, talk to us. And that's an amazing story. So the endangered right to vote. I've been teaching, talking, litigating cases for a long time on the Voting Rights Act and other matters affecting the vote. And I've always been one to recognize that as much as we like to talk about voting as a right, it's treated oftentimes as a privilege in this country, one that has to be earned and re-earned. Earned again and re-earned one more time. And that has a lot to do with how we allow structures to become part of a national fabric, but really localized and state-based decision-making. That's why some states use different kind of machines than other states, and that's why some states have more of a threshold to meet in order to vote than other states. And that's why some states decide to allow judges to become elected, but some states don't. And that's why some states gravitate towards at-large systems and some others gravitate towards district systems. And that's why some states do different things when it comes to the right to vote, because we still permit, as a matter of constitutional law, this repository of sovereignty among the states. And one of the basic badges of sovereignty is to decide some of these issues like voting. And while the Congress can set a minimum basic guarantee for voting rights, it's the states that oftentimes decide to do things differently in their very unique way, and they don't want to change it. It's exactly what undergirds the entire Electoral College, right? Because if we were writing on a blank slate, we wouldn't invite the Electoral College. It actually minimizes the right to vote and the power of the collective vote of urban America, and compared to smaller states with rural counties, or mostly rural counties. And yet that same notion of state sovereignty under the 10th Amendment, form of federalism, still undergirds these decisions at the local level and state level. But for Latinos in this country, it is an incredibly dangerous time to deal with voting rights issues. Number one, we're large. Number two, we're growing. I mean, growing by leaps and bounds. You know, right now, they were in the 2016 election, November of 2016, there was about 27.3 million Latino eligible voters. 37% of all the growth of all eligible voters from 2012 to 2016, 37% was attributable to Latinos in just that period of time. 44% of all the eligible voters in Latino USA are millennials. That's a higher proportion than any other group, than African Americans, than whites, and any Asian Americans, than any other group in this country. 44% are millennials. These are US born, young people reaching the age of 18. Citizens all. So when I talk to audiences, we have to break down what is the Latino profile, right? And break it down a little further, because it's difficult for me to explain this, except to know that when Latinas and Latinos get together, we're all really we're either Puerto Rican or Dominican or Colombian or Mexicano. And in this country, we're Latinos, I guess, but you leave this country, we're Puerto Ricans, Dominicans, Mexicanos y Dominicans, and Mexicanos y Nicaragüenses. And it's a very fascinating concept, but the fact is that the country's Latino population has been growing by leaps and bounds, but a lot of the growth has now been native born. It's birthright citizenship that's the issue, right? The immigration tides actually have been stemmed for years, especially during the second term of the Obama administration, and particularly even now. So the growth in our population is because we're having so many children compared to other groups in the country, which also explains why 44% of our eligible voter base is millennials. We have a younger median age than any other group in this country. So we're younger and we're growing by leaps and bounds, and more people every year become eligible to vote in the Latino community. So if that's the promise of growth and more participation potentially from this population, then what might be the obstacles? So my first voting rights case was literally within 2 months of my graduating from law school. And we filed a lawsuit against Mayor Koch in New York City, who presumed to, and his city law department, who presumed, and the New York City Board of Elections. At the time, we used to have in New York City this hybrid form of government. There was a board of estimate with excessive power deposited into the counties. Staten Island had the same number of votes as Brooklyn. Made no sense, but that was the way it was. And that was superimposed on a council that was a smaller council. So smaller council made larger geographical districts. Population of New York City, perhaps close to 8 million back then, maybe slightly higher, which is where it is now, more or less, right? So the population went down, then it came back up. And my first lawsuit was to challenge a redistricting plan in New York City. And it was a plan that was created for the city council, which refused to acknowledge that the growth in the city's population was mostly driven by African American and Latino populations. And yet the council districts looked the same. New York City could care less. They were going to have an election no matter what. There was a requirement under Section 5 that they get pre-clearance approval. And they ignored that requirement because they said they were doing their best. They were trying to get all the information to the Justice Department to try to get it to approve in time. It didn't get approved in time, but they had an election to hold. And it was a primary election in which Mr. Koch was running for re-election, and a number of the entire council was, I think, up for re-election. And we decided to go to court 2 days before the election, and we stopped it 1 day before the election. And wow, so you had a federal court literally issue an order to respect and comply with the clear dictates of Section 5, a provision of the Voting Rights Act, which required a place like New York to get approval before it could implement a change. So we had this a major court battle. Of course, the city's attorneys rushed to the U.S. Supreme Court, but in the U.S. Supreme Court, the justice of the U.S. Supreme Court had jurisdiction over New York State matters, happened to have been Justice Thurgood Marshall. They didn't go too far. Their arguments didn't go too far. The Justice Marshall knew the importance of the Voting Rights Act. He knew its relevance to the Black and Latino populations. And he said, well, you haven't proven why I should overturn the order to stop the election. So the elections were stopped, something almost unheard of back then. And I was the youngest attorney on a team of attorneys in that case, which if you have practiced law, meant I did all the work. All the work. I did all the research, wrote all the damn memos, somebody else put their name on it. That's the way it works when you're a young attorney. It was an exciting time for me to be an attorney. After that, I started doing redistricting cases in places like Chicago. Spent a whole winter in the winter of Chicago living out of a Ramada Inn doing a case, wow, a redistricting case for the Chicago Board of Aldermen. Another redistricting case. One of our main witnesses in our case was Harold Washington, before he became Mayor Harold Washington. And when we won that case, it changed the complexity, literally the complexity of the Chicago Board of Aldermen, that he was able with a progressive slate to become elected mayor. And I like that terminology. I work to change the complexity of legislative bodies. I work to integrate legislative bodies. The more varied and distinct and diverse these legislative bodies become, the more I think I've actually accomplished something. Now, it is true that over time, a lot of my victories, so to speak, have been cabin-holed into this notion that more Latinas and Latinos get elected, better. But at the end of the day, we have to also make sure those Latinas and Latinos be held accountable. Because at the end of the day, if they don't produce, then they should also be voted out. And at the end of the day, our communities have now, in 2017, to have risen to a level in which they should be able to decide. I'll vote for the incumbent if the incumbent makes sure I get what I need, irrespective of who's coming behind. But I say that with a grain of salt, because that might be true in a place like in the Bronx. It might be true in a place like Miami-Dade County. But I don't think it's really true across the country. And when you think about the fact that NALEO, the National Association of Latino Elected Officials, just recently said there are 6,100 Latina and Latino elected officials in the country. That represents less than 1.5% of all the elected officials in the country. For a population of 58 million Latinos in the US, 17% of the population and growing by leaps and bounds. So you have this disconnect between the parity of a population base and then everything else that comes with it in terms of being able to vote and exercise your right to vote for the candidates of your choice. So what are the obstacles? I just want to talk to you about a handful of them. the ones that I'm really, really drive my passion today. The first one is felon disfranchisement. The first one is a classic one. It's the one you read about in the books, right? You know, you think about, how do I deal with voting systems to make sure the collective voting strength of the communities that we represent in Latino Justice, PRLDEF, how do we make sure the collective voting strength is exhibited, reflected in the body politic, in the integration of those legislative bodies, right? But that's a sophisticated question. That's a question that says, you create districts, how do they represent or reflect the voting strength of communities? Because that requires all of us to act accordingly, to act in a cohesive fashion. Yes, Latinas and Latinos will act together. They'll vote for the same candidates. And yes, you can show by evidence, social scientists can show by ecological regression models about the race of voter versus the race of the candidate. And yes, racially polarized voting exists in our communities. But felon disfranchisement is much, much more basic. It doesn't even let you go to vote at all, let alone count your vote in the aggregate with other people that think like you. It is like an incredible, like, you can't even get to the voting booth because you committed one mistake that led to imprisonment in your previous life. So it's an amalgamation of all a series of these state laws that remove the basic badge of citizenship and the franchise from a segment of population. And it goes back in some of our states to over 100 years. It goes back to the civil death concepts of Anglo-Saxon law. So it came with the settlers from Britain into this country and became like this whole notion about civil death, that once you commit a transgression in society, you can be ostracized, excluded completely. It has nothing to do with redemption. It has nothing to do with restoration. And Lord knows it has nothing to do with the kind of like 4 basic principles of criminal law. We incarcerate people in this country. Why? At least from a criminological perspective. We incarcerate people to incapacitate them so they won't commit a crime while they're in jail, out of society. We incarcerate people to actually to punish, which is the biggest one. I was going to leave that for last, Michael, but you got to beat me to it. To also set an example for others. You do it, this can happen to you. We incarcerate people in this country presumably to rehabilitate. And we incarcerate people in this country to punish. So felon disfranchisement can only be understood. It doesn't do anything for the 3 other principles, right? It doesn't has anything to do with incapacitation or using you as a model to deter deterrence of other crime by other individuals. It's just simple retribution, plain and simple. And when it exists in the United States, the way it exists in the United States, it exists to punish you even after you've, quote unquote, paid your debt to society, whatever that's actually supposed to mean. But it really means that after you've left prison, it still shackles you. New York still shackles individuals after they leave prison because you have to finish parole before you can automatically be registered to vote. New Jersey shackles you even if you've never been imprisoned. If you got probation, walked out the courthouse door, front steps, even though you were convicted of crime, probation still stops you from voting in places like New Jersey. In places like Florida, where we have an office for the last 4 or 5 years, Latino Justice has had an office there, it is literally depriving 1.6 million citizens of the right to vote. Million, I said, of the right to vote. In a place that literally, and for all purposes, permanently deprives the vote. Because the only way you can have your rights restored in Florida is to petition before a clemency board. And the only way they can actually grant you the right to vote is for the clemency board to vote in your favor to restore your rights. And check this out. The governor of the state of California must be present because he chairs that clemency board. 1.6 million hearings where the governor is physically present is the only way you can get your right to vote back in Florida. And that's assuming they vote in your favor. You have to wait 10 years to even petition. It is outrageous behavior. Puerto Rico allows you to vote from your prison cell. Canada allows you to vote from your prison cell. South Africa allows you to vote from your prison cell. Israel allows you to vote from your prison cell. Vermont and Maine allow you to vote from your prison cell. Not exactly the two biggest Latino states I've ever heard of, but Vermont and Maine allows you to do it. It is incredible that I'm still talking about a vote denial practice that is rooted in racist thought, rooted in Jim Crow, and we're still debating this. 2017. You know, in the reason why I started looking at this stuff even further for Latino populations, because I also wanted to know what's it like in our host countries. I spent a lot of time in the last 10 years trying to create connections between what I want to work on here in the United States domestically and connected it back to Latin American countries, our host countries. Like, for example, I do quite a bit of other work on criminal justice policies, drug policy work, because I think they've become an obstacle for advancement of our people here in the United States. And I've always been very curious about the thinking on drug policy, for example, in Mexico, or in Colombia, or in Costa Rica, Uruguay, countries which are saying, wait a second, United States is the biggest consumer of illegal drugs in the whole hemisphere, if not the entire world. You're creating havoc. We are killing people. Every day, the worst forms of corruption and violence are seen just south of the border because of this insatiable appetite for illegal drugs in the U.S. So I wanted to hear from people in those countries and learn very quickly that a lot of Latin America also disfranchises people because of felony conviction. A lot of countries do that. In fact, most of Latin America, you can put on both sides. You can get your rights automatically restored once you leave prison, but they're definitely deprived while you're still in prison. No one does what America does, however. No one does. It's the American exceptionalism. No one does what America does. That allows you to live in a place and permanently bar you because of one felony conviction. Permanently. No grace, no restoration, no redemption. So I learned very quickly as well that we started estimating. There was a report done by some colleagues of ours that worked out of both PRLDEF and there was a public school policy in California, the Rivera Institute, and they started trying to document how many people were lost, how many votes are being lost by these practices for Latino communities. It's very hard to gauge. There's a reason why it's hard to gauge, and we'll talk about it in a minute. They were starting to estimate that about close to 500,000 votes were being lost in every election in just 4 states, the big states, the Californias, Texas, Floridas, New Yorks of the world, right? Those 4 states account for close to 70 or almost 75% of the entire Latino population, just those 4 states alone. And so they were counting that at about 500,000 votes that were being lost because of felon disfranchisement laws in those 4 states. Of course, Florida still being the worst of the 4. New York allowing for restoration upon release of parole. I also learned that Latino prisoners were always actively involved in challenging. They are part of the team of clients that challenge these practices. I myself represented Latino and African American prisoners and parolees here in New York State, trying to change it in New York State in a case called Hayden versus Pataki. A fascinating case, which we did not fully win outright. What we did win was a change in what's called prison gerrymandering. Wow. So prison gerrymandering is this concept that your body is counted as a resident of the prison in which you're located, as opposed to being counted in your home district where you lived before you went to prison, and where you know you're going to go back to after you leave prison. So if your body's not counted in Bushwick, but it's counted in some upstate New York facility, that means Bushwick loses the political power that represents an additional body, that represents an additional opportunity to equalize those districts. Bushwick loses political power to the benefit of the upstate New York County. Governor Patterson changed that. As soon as Governor Patterson signed the law to rectify it for state elections only, by the way, for state elections only, He allowed for a system to readjust the census data and count you where you lived, as opposed to counting you as if you had a choice about where you sleep when you're in a prison cell, because you don't. And that whole notion about prison gerrymandering was effectuated by a long history of trying to change both felon disfranchisement and prison gerrymandering. We lost it outright. We lost the challenge based on the Voting Rights Act, and we also lost the challenge based on the constitutionality of the felon disfranchisement law in New York State, which dates back to 1821. You see, in 1821, the first time these laws were passed, they were also passed part and parcel with laws about literacy. Because you had to be English literate in order to vote in New York State. And all those literacy tests, including as well the ones that they take away the right to vote for you if you committed a serious crime, were all passed in large part, especially the literacy test provisions, were passed to stop the growing tide of Southern and Eastern Europeans from voting in New York City. Histories that we forget so easily, right? So we were able to knock out literacy as a requirement under the 1965 Voting Rights Act, suspended all literacy tests first, and then eventually outlawed them outright 5-10 years later. But that thing about not being able to vote if you commit a serious crime stayed in the books. So I was part of a team of attorneys to try to use the Voting Rights Act and the Constitution to challenge it, and we weren't successful. The courts in New York, in Washington State, in Florida, in Massachusetts, in New Jersey, all states that had, right around the same time, we were all in coordination, trying to do this in multiple states, multiple challenges to felon disfranchisement laws, and the courts basically ruled two ways. If Congress really wanted to get rid of felon disfranchisement, it would have said so. That's what it told us. Even though the language of the law that we were using, Section 2, not Section 5, says any practice or procedure or law that results in protected classes, African Americans and language minorities having less of a right, equal right to elect candidates of choice can be challenged. Any law, I said. I cannot make this up. The law says any law. Well, I guess any law is not that law. And the court said Congress would have done this differently. These laws go back hundreds of years. So they refused to extend the Voting Rights Act. And then in places like New York and Florida, the courts told us there was a break in the chain. It may have started with some racist thought whenever it started. In Florida, clearly it started with racism in mind. And the ones in New York, there was documented evidence in the constitutional conventions of the 1800s that talked about how it was aimed at men of color. Because remember, voting was all men back then, right? Men of color was the language being used. But the courts in New York told us there was a break. There was a 3-year gap in which the law lapsed. So whatever that original intent was, didn't carry over 3 years in the gap. So when it was reenacted anew, presumably for less than racist motives, it was enacted and done away with, and we couldn't challenge it. It is still the law in New York. Every year, people like John Conyers and others submit a proposal to Congress, let's restore the right to vote as soon as you leave prison. And every year, it doesn't get the traction that it should. So every year, we have to challenge these things in other ways. Some states are doing it on their own, but it's still an uphill battle. That badge of citizenship is deprived of anybody who has to spend any time in a cage as a result of felony conviction. And it's an outrageous affront to democracy for our country. And it affects Latinos in numbers that are really, really high. And my last point, vote suppression. So it's amazing that you have Professor Smith here and part of this incredible project here at the School of Baruch, because he's done amazing work on this issue, talking about the stigma being, what it means to be a person who's eligible to vote, but because you have this you throw out this whole notion of illegal voters, and that creates a stigma that you're completely not legitimate in the United States. And that has a lot to do with suppressing people's ability to change, suppressing people's ability to do it so without intimidation. So vote suppression is what I would call in Puerto Rico el cuco, the monster, el chupacabra, right? It exists, it's out there, it's gonna kill you one day, it's gonna get you, it's really gonna get you. I wish I brought this image in a way that would allow us to see it on screen, but maybe you can see it here. Alien. This is where the illegal voters come from. Look at this image right here. This is a report in 2016 in Virginia. 2016, not 1916. 2016. The alien voters are coming out of a spaceship to change and rob the vote in Virginia. Unbelievable. There is no evidence of voter fraud, and to the extent there is, it's like almost so minuscule it's ridiculous, right? It's 0.00004%. There's like 31 cases of alleged voter fraud, 31 individual cases, and 1 billion votes, 1 billion that were cast. I mean, who has the gall to walk up to a voter booth and say, my name is Juan Cartagena, I want to vote here, even though their name is not Juan Cartagena? I mean, you got to really have a lot of gall. Think about it. You know, how many laws are you breaking, Joe? You had the gall to walk up there and say, my name is Juan Cartagena, I want to vote here. And then drive across town. My name is Juan Cartagena, I want to vote here again. I mean, come on. Think about this. And then to assume that it's really undocumented Latino people who are doing this, that's what the assumption is, right? These are populations that don't want to do anything don't have any bearing with government unless they really, really need government services. And they're voluntarily going into these voting booths and saying, their name is Juan Cartagena, let me vote 4 times in 4 different locations. Absentee ballot fraud has been with us from the time I started working on voting rights. None of these voter ID laws change absentee ballot fraud. They don't affect it. Voter ID laws only affect what happens at the voting booth on the day of election, not how you got to your name or signature on an absentee ballot. And absentee ballot fraud is constant. But I want to end with this episode. It happened to us in Florida. Florida, that wonderful hotbed of great voting rights history, right? Florida, an incredible hotbed of criminal justice history. Wow. You intersect those two, that's what you get in Florida. A mí siempre se me ocurre, I don't understand why so many Puerto Ricans would go to Florida because, wow, if they had to pick a state to move to, All right, so it's got the weather, I get that. Cheap airfare, I get that. But wow, it's a right-to-work state. It's got some of the best health care provisions in the world. It's got some of the worst criminal justice policies you can imagine. All right. We're still dealing with Florida migration in record numbers. But in this case that actually happened in 2012, Florida's Secretary of State had insisted that non-citizen voting was a major problem. Non-citizen voting. And the Florida Secretary of State insisted that originally that there was about 130,000 non-citizen voters in Florida. And they apparently had documentation. When pressed finally, when the public and the journalists finally pressed the Secretary of State to come up with a list, he did come up with a list. It had 2,600 names, not the 130,000 names that he claimed. Of the 2,600 names, many of them were citizens of the United States. So you might ask yourself, how did it happen? Well, part of it is because the Secretary of State was using databases that were relatively old. So if 10 years before the 2012 election, you got a juror questionnaire in your mailbox, and you were not a citizen 10 years ago, you said, I cannot serve because I'm not a citizen. So now Juan Cartagena's list is name is on a list of non-citizens 10 years hence, 10 years before. So Cartagena's name is still on the list 10 years later, even though by then I've naturalized. And that happens to many of our clients. 2,600 names. So we had a client by Mrs. Arcia, the case is actually called Arcia versus Detzner. 61% of all the people on that list were Latino. 14% of all Florida voters are Latino. 16% of the people on that list were black. Only 14% of all voters were black in Florida at that time. 16% of the people on the list were white. 70% of all the voters in Florida at that time were white. We had to sue to restore the vote for alleged non-voting by a purge, a non-voting purge. Purging processes allow systems to clean their election rolls. They're necessary. It's called part of what we call list maintenance. They have to clean out the dead wood, make sure those people are legit. We see this happening all the time. My office filed a lawsuit in 2016 against Kings County for what happened there with the purging of so many people in Brooklyn. And we're very close to potentially settling that case. Again, list maintenance occurs all the time in these systems. The real question for us is whether or not they're occurring correctly and in a way that makes sense. The National Voter Registration Act prohibits a purge to occur anytime less than 90 days before a federal election. So if you cannot do it, you got to give at least 90 days notice before you purge, any kind of purge, before a federal election. Why? Because the systems make mistakes. The thought here is in 90 days, you might be able to correct the mistake and get your name back on the roll before the federal election. Florida ignored the 90-day cutoff, just like New York ignored the pre-clearance cutoff when Koch was around. I can talk to you about horror stories of all my time in voting for a long, long time, for hours, really. But I wanted to end with hope, right? And the hope is the way I see people who last hours on a line to vote. The images of people in Florida left hours and hours in early voting and refuse to leave the line. The people who actually go out of their way to register voters and put in all this hard work to register new voters. That's the hope. You know, the lines and lines of people during Obama's 2 elections. That's the hope. I once worked on a case in Jersey City, New Jersey, where I happened to live, and there was a mayor who was in a runoff election. It was an Irish mayor, and the challenger was Italian. The Italian had all the support of black and Puerto Rican voters. This was in the 1980s in Jersey City. And the Irish mayor knew that, so they engaged in the runoff election strategy to, quote-unquote, slow down the vote. Slow it down. That's the actual words of the campaign strategy. We found notes of the campaign manager telling people on election day, slow down the vote. So we had all that evidence, and you ask, how do you slow down the vote? Well, you slow down the vote by excessively challenging people at the voting booth, demanding ID, changing the people who normally work the tables, and changing them with people that don't even know the neighborhood. That all happened. We had that mayor, his name is McCann, by the way. McCann even had off-duty police officers taking the place of well-trusted veteran polling workers, all on purpose, to quote-unquote slow down the vote. You know what Jersey City's black and Puerto Rican voters did that day? They went back for their ID. They came back with their brother. They came back with their aunts. They came back with their children. And they stood online. And the courts had to extend the voting booth hours to 10 o'clock in the evening. That night, the Italian challenger won. We might take this for granted in this country. We might commiserate about the fact that it's not really a right, that a privilege has to be earned and over again. But there are so many episodes in this country where I can be proud of the fact that we can help change the fabric of our government, change the complexity of our government by something as simple as voting and encouraging others to vote. Thank you very much.